Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade. Thanks in large parts due to the personal and heroic intervention of Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, the Crusade had been spared an enormous threat to its rear. Had Vervunhive fallen, then, unbeknownst to Crusade Command, an enormous danger would have arisen right behind it as it pushed on towards the Cabal system. As the loss of Vervunhive would not merely have deprived the Imperium of a major manufacturing world, but would also have created an enemy stronghold in its rear lines, sitting perfectly poised to begin severing the already tenuous lines of supplies that Macaroth had so vigorously overstretched in his chase for the horizon. But of even greater import than the victory itself was the slaying of Heritor Asphodel, one of the leading Chaos commanders in the entire Sabbat worlds, and, according to Imperial intelligence, one of the prime contenders for the seat of Archon, Supreme Commander over all Chaos forces. With the removal of the Heritor's chess piece from the board, not only had the enemy been denied one of its greatest strategic minds, but it had also almost certainly redoubled the chaos and panic caused by the death of Archon Nadzibar. And as worrying as the potential implications of a chaos Vervunhive would have been, it was also yet another reason to assume that the enemy was scattered and leaderless. After all, what had Vervunhive truly been to the forces of chaos beyond a desperate rearguard action, where one of its greatest leaders launched a Hail Mary attempt to reforge the influence and strength that he had so clearly lost at Balhut? The Warmaster Macaroth was therefore in a damn good mood in the waning days of the year 669, where everything seemed to be going the Imperium's way. Yes, sure, the Warmaster's front line was as stretched as ever, his supply problems were constant, but they were dealt with enough at least to facilitate the invasion of the Cabal system, which was set for early next year. And with yet another enemy leader out of the picture, there seemed to be very little danger of a unified front forming against the Crusade, as Imperial intelligence was convinced that the enemy was still in the midst of an internecine conflict. The countless lieutenants, generals, and commanders of the Chaos host now waging bloody wars against one another over the question of whom should take up the mantle of Archon. Imperial intelligence assumed that it would largely be between two of the major tribes and cultures, the Umbra Baal or the Sidmathikin, with the latter being the most likely to eventually assume command in the view of Imperial intelligence, as it was led by Anaquana Sek, a magister that had demonstrated tremendous strategic acumen earlier on in the Crusade. Sek was also expected to be the magister in command of the single largest organized army that remained on the Chaos side. He had the most chieftains and the most tribes sworn to him, and he probably commanded the largest remaining swath of Chaos-held territories. There were of course other potential replacements as well, such as the Gaurite tribe, but these were largely dismissed as unrealistic replacements for the great Archon Nadzibar, and thus, confident that the enemy was still scattered and leaderless, the assault upon the Cabal system commenced in full in the year 770. and the offensive met with immediate and remarkable success. 8 worlds fell to the advancing Imperial Guard and Navy forces, including the fortress worlds of Solveig and Athra. These successes straight down the center of the Cabal system drove a wedge into the defenders, forcing large Chaos forces to flee outright before the Imperium's advance, causing Macaroth to indulge in a rare moment of public boasting, announcing to all who would listen that the Cabal system, declared an impossible and ludicrous objective by so many high Imperial commanders years before, was now set to collapse completely and be neutralized well before midwinter of the year 771. And Macaroth was to be swiftly reminded of why he doesn't make many such public boasts, as the enemy moved immediately to refute the Warmaster's statement, and rather vigorously so as well. This would turn into a bit of a triple disaster for Warmaster Macaroth. Firstly, in immediately tactical terms as far as the campaign for the Cabal system was concerned, the early swift and easy progress came to a screeching halt on the planets of Jago, Morlund, and Chanika, where the enemy, who had seemingly by all accounts been in rout, dug themselves in and grew thoroughly stuck, bringing the entire offensive to a screeching and bloody halt as Imperial Guard armies were tossed at these 3 worlds in hitherto unseen quantities, only to be ground into messy pulp and spat right back out again. This indirect turn, of course, led to the second disaster, a political disaster. Just as it appeared as if Macaroth's grand predictions for a swift end to the Sabbat World's Crusade was coming true, and all of his generals were beginning to give him the benefit of the doubt, many even having been converts from the hardcore anti-Macarothian faction, well, this setback undid the vast majority of that good work. Those who had been mere days or weeks away from finally declaring that they had been wrong all along, and that Macaroth's bold gambit had been one of genius, now retreated yet deeper into their judgmental ways than ever before. Macaroth appeared to have stumbled right at the very goal line. But at the very least, so long as it was merely a delay, then so be it. Not the worst thing that could happen to a system-scale crusade, after all. But then came the third disaster. And to illustrate it, we need to take a step back again and rejoin the Colonel Commissar and the Tanith First and Only, a name the regiment had resolved to retain, despite the fact that, of course, now it no longer counted only Tanith men amongst its ranks, but Vervunhive men and women as well. A change that had already caused no small amount of friction. Obviously, the Vervunhives were proud to be a part of the regiment that had aided in saving their city, and the regiment of the new people's hero Ibrahim Gaunt. Thus, they were more than happy to respect many of the Tanith traditions, and that the regiment would retain their name, and that the second in command would always be a Tanith officer. But the women, that was probably the single biggest point of contention between the two quickly forming factions. The Colonel Commissar would have a tough task ahead of him, alloying the two together into a grander and stronger whole. See, the simple addition of women into a combat unit makes things complicated. For, incidentally, the exact same reasons that men and women can rarely coexist in close proximity to one another without aforementioned complications. The Tanith First and Only had largely been a model regiment, but with the addition of the Vervunhive, fights had been breaking out quite often. The Tanith themselves, of course, had not seen a great deal of women for quite some time, and those that they did see were either usually civilians, and therefore off-limits, or the various camp followers and prostitutes that attached themselves to any regiment, and, well, that's not quite the same as having a, woman around, shall we say. The Vervunhive on their sides felt an urge to protect their women's honor from the Tanith, who were all too eager to infringe upon aforementioned honor. This was the spark that kindled many a fight as the regiment was transitioning towards its next objective, which was to be the shrine world of Hagia. But a potentially even more pernicious threat would be what would happen when a man actually managed to land himself a woman. You think good old-fashioned lust is dangerous to unit cohesion? Oh, wait till you get a load of jealousy. Suffice to say, the green-eyed bitch does not mix particularly well with large quantities of men, firearms, and testosterone. But enough of the upcoming woes of the Tanith First and Only. Returning to the point, the regiment, along with its Colonel Commissar, now rather famous, had been dispatched to the shrine world of Hagia, along with a significant quantity of other Imperial Guard troops, to reclaim this sacred planet, the birthplace of Saint Sabbat herself. Now, Warmaster Macaroth was nowhere near as, devoted to the Saint Sabbat as his predecessor Slado had been. He did not see the footsteps of destiny in the Crusade covering much the same ground as she had once upon a time. But every good Imperial citizen, of course, understands that it is their duty to protect and uphold that which is sacred. And few things could be more immediately holy than the home world of a saint. And so it needed to be liberated from the danger of chaos occupation as swiftly as possible. Now, Hagia too had been bypassed by Archon Nadzibar's rush to the edges of the Sabbat worlds. As whilst the planet was, again, absolutely valuable in its own right, it offered very little immediate strategic advantage. And whilst I'm sure that Chaos could find a whole slew of interesting reasons to occupy a saint's homeworld, these proclivities were significantly less pressing than forming a solid front line to thwart and or discourage any immediate Imperial aggression upon the Sabbat worlds. However, after the loss of the Archon, his iron-fisted rule collapsed with him, and many Chaos warlords would much rather desecrate a saint's homeworld than sit in a bunker line somewhere. And so, Hagia, at long last, was visited by the arch-enemy. A significant invasion force under the command of one Father Sin had descended upon the world and waged war against its defenders. Now, Hagia, being a shrine world of some significance, had a pretty hefty PDF presence, which had been slowly but surely worn down over the years, between the victory at Balhat and the Imperial Guard now being able to rush to the world's rescue. Most of the planet's major urban centers had fallen to the so-called Infardi, which was what the Chaos Forces called themselves on Hagia, a bastardization of the Hagian word for pilgrim, and the Imperial Guard now had to come and dig them out. The Imperial effort was to be commanded by a Lord General Lugo, You may remember that name. Lugo was one of Macaroth's young and upcoming generals that had so thoroughly botched the seemingly unbotchable job of invading Oscilia 9 earlier in the Crusade. This had of course left quite the dent in the Lord General's reputation, and indirectly a rather large one in Macaroth's reputation as well. In order to get back in the good graces of his commanders, and in order for Macaroth to polish his bruised armor once more, Lugo championed aggressively behind the scenes to replace Lord Militant Buledin in the attack on Hagia. Lugo figured that not only would Hagia be an easy win, as at this point the world was located far behind Imperial lines, and he would have more than adequate forces to overcome any remaining already exhausted and presumably scattered resistance, but he would also be able to glory in the conquest of the Saints' very own homeworld. With a little bit of clever maneuvering, and Lugo was nothing if not a cunning political animal, he might very well be able to ride this single victory alone for a very, very long distance up the ladder indeed, leaving behind his humble position as a mere Lord General, and reaching for something more gilded. And to give the man his credit, he commanded the initial stages of the invasion quite well. The enemy was defeated in the open and swiftly realized that there was no future in a straight-up engagement with the Imperial Guard and their armored regiments. Instead, they began retreating into the urban centers, occupying the shrines and churches in the hope that this might deter the Imperium's aggression. Well, Lugo might be as pious a man as any Imperial citizen is expected to be, but he was, first and foremost, a realistic man. And the enemy hiding within gilded marble halls did significantly less to hinder his aggression than the Infardi had hoped. Urban center fell after urban center. Victories were secured all across Hagia, and it seemed as if a complete defeat of the enemy was at hand in record time. The only remaining major objective vexing the Lord General was the Doctrinopolis, the largest and most prestigious of the urban centers and places of worships on the planet. The seizure of this city would be difficult, as it was a large city, and secondly, it would be a delicate affair, as any destruction wrought upon those particular temples would be an even more thorny political and religious subject than usual. Therefore, he granted the honor of commanding this assault to Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt. If he made a mess of it, well, then Lugo had somebody to blame. But if he succeeded, not only could Lugo still claim the majority of the credit for having picked such an obviously competent individual, but he could also bathe in the glory of the Colonel Commissar's recent victory on Vervunhive. As I said, the Lord General had many flaws, but his politicking was quite excellent. To achieve this objective of seizing the Doctrinopolis, the Colonel Commissar was granted overall command of a regiment of Pardue armor and 2 infantry regiments in addition to his own Tanith first and only, these being another regiment of Pardue and the Brevian Centennials. Unfortunately for the Colonel Commissar, the enemy were not accommodating enough to stand outside the city and be obediently slaughtered by the Pardue armor. Instead, the moment they had begun their assault, the Infardi had retreated inside of the Doctrinopolis, forcing the guard to winkle them out one house at a time. It was slow and bloody fighting, and at one point, the second-in-command of the Tanith First and Only was reported as killed, this being Colonel Colm Corbeck. This report was later to be revealed to be incorrect, as the colonel had been taken prisoner and brought to Father Sin himself, of all people, only to be rescued at the very last moment by a group of Tanith officers and volunteers. It would turn out that they rescued their second-in-command just in the nick of time as well. Under pressure to complete the conquest of the Doctrinopolis quickly, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt had ordered a redoubling of the offensive efforts to seize the central citadel at the top of the Doctrinopolis. He had ordered the Brevian Centennials to lead the charge up into it, and so they did, punching their way through what appeared to be a surprisingly desultory amount of resistance. Arriving at the summit, they discovered that the massive cathedral at the top had been completely stripped of all holy items. This, unsurprisingly, was rather disconcerting for the Brevian Centennials, and their frontline leader, Major Zarbo, was beginning to worry that they'd fallen into some sort of an ambush, and, well, he was right, but not the kind of ambush that he might have expected. As he looked around, men all around him began dropping onto their hands and legs, vomiting up rivulets of blood, even as the Major's own vision started to turn a darkish red as his eyeballs and every orifice on his body began to bleed. And there were insects crawling in the blood. The Major attempted to vox a desperate warning to the rest of the army, but it was no use. Moments thereafter, the citadel simply exploded, sending showers of debris flying kilometers out into the area surrounding the urban center, a center itself which was quickly engulfed by flame. All troops within the city immediately turned and began to run desperately down the hill again. Some survived, many did not. Virtually the entirety of the Centennials were wiped out during that explosion. Only 2 brigades that had been rotated out of the line previously and were therefore not a part of the offensive survived. But of even greater significance than the loss of nearly an entire Imperial Guard regiment was not just the destruction of the Doctrinopolis and its citadel, but its desecration, as the entire Doctrinopolis was covered in strange ethereal bluish-green flames shooting upwards of a kilometer into the air. The unnatural flame could not be doused, and any attempt to get even within half a kilometer of the city was rendered impossible, not merely because of the heat, but due to the vomiting of blood and maggots. Prayer rituals were begun by the Ayatani preachers that had come either out of the city having been rescued, or come to it as a pilgrimage, hoping to be there when the Doctrinopolis was liberated. But it would take a very, very long time for them to quell the disturbing fire raging across the Doctrinopolis. The failure weighed particularly heavily on the Colonel Commissar's shoulders. Ibrahim Gaunt was a devout man, particularly when it concerned the Saint Sabbat, and he was the one in command of this battlefront. He was the one who had ordered the Tanith, who were launching scouting and reconnaissance efforts into the Doctrinopolis in an effort to, well, uncover precisely something like this, to be pulled back in order to clear the ground for the Centennials' own heavier assault directly up into the citadel. Sure, he had been pressured by Lugo to do so, but at the end of the day, it was the Colonel Commissar who was in command of the assault. It was his decision to make, and his error to make as well. An error near immediately leapt upon by Lord General Lugo, of course, who was now in need of a scapegoat. and one in the peaked cap of a commissar would do just fine. But even as Lord General Luca was preparing to toss Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt as far underneath the bus as he was physically capable of doing, more pressing matters revealed themselves. The destruction of the Doctrinopolis had not merely been some arch-enemy terror weapon. It was a psychic beacon, fueled by the sacrifice not just of the Centennials, but also presumably the destruction of the holy icons that had once inhabited that place. This psychic beacon had now become, in essence, an enormous warp lighthouse, which had already drawn significant attention. This was probably a part of a very long-term plan, as massed enemy reinforcements were now on the way to Hagia. The entire world had, apparently, been a trap for the Crusade, and with the assault on the Cabal system fully underway, all available Imperial Guard forces were either dedicated to the assault, to reinforcing the assault, or protecting and strong-pointing the offensive's immediate supply lines. There were no reinforcements available to come to Hagia. None whatsoever. And the scale of the enemy's counter-thrust was such that those Imperial Guard forces already on-world, alongside the Hagian PDF defenders that had survived the initial invasion, would not stand a single solitary chance against them. This would be the third disaster that befell Warmaster Macaroth, as he was now facing not only immediate tactical stagnation during the invasion of the Cabal system or political humiliation, but also a major strategic setback, as he seemed to have overextended his army, stretching his neck out into the Cabal system, readied for a decapitating move straight across his line of advance. This was no sporadic coincidence, no wild attempt by a local magister or warlord to interfere with the War Master's measures. This was a major offensive, and Hagia was but the first indication of what was about to come, as multiple worlds all across the Crusade's line of advance would be placed under attack by amassed and unified arch-enemy forces, being led by the Blood Pact. This twisted mirror of the Imperial Guard, as the arch-enemy had built up the Blood Pact specifically on the blueprint of the Imperial Guard, using Guard weaponry, Guard tactics, Guard strategies, Guard equipment, and Guard organization to create an effective fighting force, had been encountered previously during the Sabbat World's Crusade, but had been viewed by Imperial intelligence as nothing more than a small elite force, presumably pledged to some minor warlord or other. They were a planetary threat, absolutely, and a major issue if encountered on a singular world basis, but they were not in any position to launch major offensives across multiple planets at once. Or so at least had been the view of Imperial intelligence before they lost 4 and more worlds to the Blood Pact, descending upon these planets in their hundreds of thousands, and turning what had, just mere months before, seemed to be an overextended but yet still solid Imperial position into one seemingly mere months or weeks away from complete encirclement and annihilation. The assault on the Cabal worlds was now supported only by a thin corridor, held open mainly by the worlds of Lotun and Samarcus, which ran their own void paths to Khan 3 and Kaskor and Khan 4, and hopefully soon to Hagia and Verghast behind it. But now, with a threat rising from the south and a major invasion of Hagia apparently on the way, it seemed as if the jaws of a titanic beast was about to close around the neck of the Warmaster leading his troops on Moorland. And hey, considering the fact that the entirety of the Crusade's command structure and the majority of its fighting forces were now at risk of being encircled and slowly but surely annihilated, the fate of our Colonel Commissar honestly seems somewhat trivial at this point. But it was the Colonel Commissar, or at the very least, the events that occurred around him, that would see the Crusade gain a new lease on life. So we'd better have a look at it. General Lugo had, after taking advice from his own Commissar Victor Hark, decided to give the Colonel Commissar one more mission. It was to go to a place called the Shrinehold, quite some distance away from the Doctrinopolis, to recover the remains of Saint Sabbat, who were interned within it. Afterwards, the Colonel Commissar was to turn around and bring the remains back down to the Doctrinopolis for immediate evacuation, as the remains of the saints could obviously not be allowed to fall into the hands of the enemy. It was, therefore, in essence, an honor guard assignment, and one that would be able to restore at least a measure of the Colonel Commissar's honor. And, as mentioned again, it was a cause championed primarily by Victor Hark, the Commissar who was now attached to the Tanith for the duration of the mission and their Pardue armored support elements, as he thought that the Colonel Commissar did not deserve to go out in ignominy. He had contributed vastly to the cause of the Crusade, and simply allowing him to become Lugo's scapegoat did not sit well with the Commissar, despite the fact that Lugo had pretty much decided to do just that, and had only been convinced at the 11th hour. Thus it was that the Tanith and a number of Pardue armored vehicles, along with motorized transports, were gathered together under the command of the Colonel Commissar and dispatched up into the mountains towards the Shrinehold. They were expected to be able to pretty much just drive straight there, with minimal, if indeed any, enemy resistance at all in front of them, as the Infardi infestation of the planet had surely been mostly shattered now. Well, that was to prove a optimistic assessment, as no, not at all. The Infardi had merely fallen back into the planet's hinterland as a part of an organized withdrawal, ready to rise up and counterattack against the Imperial Guard occupiers, in order to interfere with their evacuation procedures and keep them pinned in place until the main strength of the Chaos Forces arrived to wipe them out. The Tanith column had to fight its way through both ambushes and one pitched battle featuring a traitor Baneblade on their way to the Shrinehold. This, unsurprisingly, delayed them somewhat, and the early arrival of the Chaos reinforcements as well meant that there was no hope of the Tanith returning back to the evacuation zone, even if they were inclined to bring the Saints' remains with them, and they were not. As after arriving at the Shrinehold, they were informed that the Saints' remains could not and should not be moved under any circumstances. And with a massive army of Infardi cultists behind the Tanith on the only traversable mountain path, well, the choice, frankly, was academic at that point. And so, abandoned on top of a literal mountain, with nowhere to escape to and only a couple of monastery walls in between them, and thousands upon thousands of screaming cultists and armored vehicles. This, by all reasonable estimates, should be the, third time the Tanith, first and only, should be wiped out by the forces of the archenemy, but fortunately, Providence yet again descends down on Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's side, although from a rather unexpected direction. You see, several Tanith had been left behind, including a couple of Vervunhives, after the battle at the Doctrinopolis. These were the ones who were too severely injured to join the column that were heading to the Shrinehold. These were supposed to be evacuated alongside the other Imperial Guard forces. But Colonel Colm Korbeck and Captain Bandur, a Tanith and a Vervunhistite officer, had both decided that that's not how this was going to end. They recruited whomever else they could find of the walking wounded, relatively speaking, and appropriated a Munitorum vehicle, a chimera, which they dubbed the Wounded Wagon, due in large part to the fact that it too was about as wounded as any of the troopers on board it and would require frequent care and maintenance to coax it back into life whenever it's tried to give up the ghost. The blessed relief of death eventually descended upon the Chimera, however, forcing our wounded heroes to ascend the Ladder of Heaven, which was an old path up to the Siren Hold, where the rest of the Tanith were now located. It was 4 kilometers high and about 25,000 steps. A journey that would usually take, about a week or so. Yeah, that was no doubt an interesting ascent. But fortunately, our wounded heroes arrived just in time, because they had brought with them 2 very important individuals. The first was a young girl, a Isholai, which was apparently some sort of profession on the world of Hagia. They were individuals who would simply study anything and continue to study for the entirety of their lives. If everything went well, they would eventually become some sort of expert on something, or preferably multiple things, but in essence they are failed college students. This young girl, by the name of Sarnian, however, had a far grander destiny laid out for her, which we'll get back to a little bit later. But the ascent up the ladder to heaven and her acquaintance with the Tanith soldiers, including Bryn Milo, would be very, very, very important things indeed for her later journey. But the single most important individual to take the climb up the stairs was not a Tanith trooper, but in fact instead a Vervunhistite by the name of Nikeg Vamberfeld. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about Vamberfeld. He had joined up with the Tanith first and only, accepting the decree offered by Warmaster Macaroth to the population of Vervunhive if they wished to leave the world and ascend up into the stars. He had lost his family during the siege, and he had worked as a humble commercier clerk. During the fighting at the Doctrinopolis, he had been wounded and had appeared to be suffering from some sort of brain injury, perhaps, as he suddenly started seeing visions of the saint. Straight up holy visions. These visions were a large part of why the wounded wagon wandered off on its journey to begin with. By the time that Vamberfeld and the other wounded arrived at the Shrinehold, it had already resisted the massed chaos attacks for quite some time. But now a final, overwhelming assault was brewing. Just as it seemed like everything was lost, Vamberfeld snuck away from the other wounded, and wandered out onto an exposed area of the shrine hold, towards what appeared to be an obelisk-like structure, a memorial structure of some sort. This is where Vamberfeld had his final vision of Saint Sabbat, and where he was also wounded 9 times. The 9 sacred wounds of the Saintess, with the 9th and final one killing Vamberfeld just as he reached what he must have thought would have been some sort of sacred obelisk. In reality, however, it was a psychically activated weapon of both remarkable precision and power, as it managed to blow out the minds of every single cultists only attacking the Shrinehold. And even more impressively, the psychic bow wave of the weapon's activation shot up into the void, where the Chaos Fleet was just beginning to arrive, and scattered it, collapsing its warp bubbles and blowing the surviving warships to the ends of the Immaterium. No doubt the Chaos Warfleet would have suffered catastrophic casualties as, well, a warp translation is not something you just interrupt. Not without some serious consequences. Thus, one of the major dangers to the Crusade's line of advance was destroyed, thanks to a lowly clerk from the Commissaire of Verghast. Quite the turn of events, to be sure, and Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt and his honor guard were able to return back down the mountain with their honor intact. Commissar Hark, who had even threatened at one moment to execute the Colonel Commissar if he did not follow orders, well, he'd actually grown quite fond of the regiment by now, and would stick with it, especially as his previous master Lugo, well, let's just say that his efforts to save his ass had also backfired rather spectacularly. Although, being the politically minded gentleman that he was, he would soon find another way to get back into a more prominent position, one which would include a certain young Isholai, who had realized that the truth of the galaxy was not hugs and roses, but rather bolters and flamethrowers. But that is a story for another day. For now, at least, the threat to the Crusade's northern flank had been averted, through means apparently put in place a very, very long time ago. Perhaps Slido had been onto something when he initiated the Crusade with the idea of following the Saints' footsteps. Perhaps some of this had in fact actually been predicted by the Saintess Sabbat. Or perhaps this was another example of rather meaty plot armor. The Colonel Commissar sure does live a charmed life. And he was going to need every last drop of that charm he could possibly muster to survive the coming years. As during the last few days of 771, a period that had been initiated with such hope and optimism, well, it didn't seem quite so optimistic anymore. Even if one of the pincering tooths had been broken, the other was still worrying away at the Crusade's jugular, and many desperate battles would now need to be fought for the Crusade's very continued existence. There were busy days ahead for the Colonel Commissar and the Tanith First and Only. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.